Right, so we're ready to join Jay Martin in just a minute. And he'll be talking about what he thinks of the election. And, why did it go the way that it seemed to go? Was it all just to do with the Brexit position, for example? So, and also, yes, that just to confirm that the bit before was a comedy bit, and that was going to be part of the 107 playlist chart, which isn't quite ready yet, but will be put out sometime tomorrow, I think. And so that's what we're doing now. So I'll just try and connect with Jay Martin to see what he thinks about this election of the 12th of December and why it seemed to go the way that it did. Hello. Happy 2020 and Saturday afternoon.
Well, thank you very much. How's everything going?
Oh, not too bad. Actually, I had a few technical problems where I was actually listening to the FM radio output and just wondered why I couldn't hear my voice coming through, and suddenly you must have heard a few tapping the microphone and that sort of thing. Wondering why it went wrong with this. I mean, this computer's actually, I got this during the New Labour era, just to give you some idea of how long this has been going for now.
It's an antique.
Well, it is, yes. And the problem with computers that are old is they're kind of slow and unresponsive, but it's got all the various things attached to it. Makes it hard to upgrade it to a new computer and put the same recording stuff in. So that'll be the reason why it has to get maintained, I think. Now, so just in case some of the previous audio didn't go out, just to say that the last bit that you heard was a comedy review 2019 that you'll get as part of the 107 playlist chart, which looks back over the year, the top 40, that doesn't just include the big chart hits, but also includes some of the local independent artists and soundtrack hits and other things that might have made it during 2019. Slightly alternative, and that I'm still working on it now. Should be coming on tomorrow afternoon, perhaps, finally. That one. Right, so we're here to talk about Labour's result, presumably, and what happened. And it was kind of an historic loss, though, so it's something that is going to shake up things, no matter how we look at it, surely. So what do you think? Do you think the blame can be put on Brexit in terms of Labour's failure to at least go up to where they were in 2017 with this election?
I think in part, yes. It would be silly to suggest that otherwise. I think in some seats there was a pretty poor campaign organised, but I suppose Brexit, and I have to say quite a large part of the result was the constant negative press. It's very difficult to get a positive message out when you're constantly bombarded with nonsense from, yes, the mainstream media. I think that, there's no point in dressing up a loss as a victory in any way, but we did manage to retain at least 1 million votes on what was picked up in 2017. Clearly, I have a saying that countries tend to get the governments they deserve, and yes, the future it doesn't look particularly great at the moment.
No, so it seems to happen to any Labour leader. People say it was because Jeremy Corbyn was far to the left and such. And of course, in the last interview we talked about how in many other European countries it's seen as much more conventional what he was proposing. In fact, it's they're almost living. In fact, they are living the sort of policies that he was going to create in some countries. But it doesn't seem to matter who is the Labour leader, does it? Because you have, Ed Miliband, for example, was criticised for the way he ate a sandwich or something. So it doesn't matter. In a way, we've got this leadership election coming up, and some people will be thinking about, who can we best present to the media against the Conservatives, because obviously we need somebody who can take them on the onslaught. But it doesn't seem to matter who it is. Because the Labour leader will always have unless it's the Tony Blair situation where he actually went to have dinner with with Rupert Murdoch and got the Sun to print a headline, "The Sun backs Blair."
Well, what I have to say really from the outset with this interview is I will speak the truth as I know it. might not be comfortable listening, but it will be the truth, and it will be a warning. I think it's a very frightening prospect to suggest that the direction of the Labour Party or of any opposition is governed by media. I think that's particularly dangerous. A lot of the, I know when we spoke last time, the answers and the comments on the doors were about Jeremy Corbyn, but by and large the policies seem to resonate. Now, is it that the leader didn't? Well, I'm not so sure about that. A lot of young people certainly resonated with Jeremy. I genuinely believe that the reason for the losses is because of the media, and I think that the Labour Party shouldn't pander to what the Sun has to say, Murdoch and the Barclay brothers and the others. I think that there should be a credible alternative, and I think in terms of the leadership election, I'm watching this with a very close eye. There are some people who've put their hat in the ring. Jess Phillips, for example, who I'm not sure I would trust her to locate a bottle of beer in a beer factory, to be fair, brewery. She is, quite hideous, really. She's clearly opens her mouth before she thinks. Some of her views have been described as transphobic, racist. I just wouldn't. I'd be ashamed, really, if the Labour Party put someone like that, someone who laughed when she was given the exit poll results. I just think that that's not a direction that we want to go down. I have some reservations with some of the others. Lisa Nandy, Lisa's worked with the Unite the Union and some other trade unions, and I have to say it's a bit of a mixed bag. Personally, she's a very good constituency MP, but we're not against the incompetence of Theresa May. We're up against a neocon, ruthless, hard right government, and we need quick answers. I just don't think Nandi is that person. Where I would draw my eyes to is the likes of Rebecca Long-Bailey. I think it's about time the Labour Party actually had an MP from the North. The last leader, not MPs, sorry. Although a few more Northern MPs would have been nice, the election. But I think whilst I like Emily Thornberry and would be wholly supportive of her, should she put a hat in the ring, I think that when we consider, really, it was sort of Harold Wilson who was the last Northern leader of the party and Prime Minister. I think that the next MP, I keep saying MP, the next leader should come from the North. That would be my take. So I think my support is with Rebecca Long-Bailey. I think she would be very capable. I know Keir Starmer's the front runner. I think my view on Keir is he's very capable, but I think that he would potentially have the sort of Gordon Brown. He's what's needed at the minute, but I think people would find him a bit dull by and large. But yes, they're my thoughts on the leadership contest. I think that whomever the Labour Party elects, the campaign should be done with civility. We're electing a leader. We're not ripping ourselves apart.
And it still seems to be quite. It seems to be a broad party, so it seems that the choice will be to carry on almost with the the Corbyn sort of policies, and maybe Rebecca Long Bailey would be a continuation of many of them. Then you've got the likes of Keir Starmer, kind of would take it back slightly towards the slightly Tony Blair sort of direction, and then you've got people like Ian Lavery. He's doing very well. He's an ex-miner. He can really, he can really put people in their place. So he's a potential one. So the thing is, does Labour have a change of direction? Because of the disastrous election results, or does it look at it and say that this is actually was just polarised so much because of Brexit? It could be different when that is finally resolved.
Well, Brexit isn't going to be resolved. There's this notion that keeps being put out by the likes of Dominic Cummings, Johnson, and what have you, that Brexit's just sort of some click a switch. It doesn't work like that.
Well, I think we've realised that over the last 3 or 4 years.
Yes, if you look at the Brexit timetable, Britain remains in the customs union and the single market up until the end of this year, and then it leaves with or without a deal. The idea that the transition period could last a year economically makes no sense whatsoever. It's far too short a time frame. Even with these comments around, we're already aligned, so it'd be much easier. It just doesn't work like that. And any trade representative or anyone who's worked with the EU, or in fact even in Whitehall, would agree with that.
So what do you think about January the 31st then, being now that they have this majority? Boris has this majority that he can stop it being blocked in the same way that October 31 and March 31 and other deadlines from last year were. Do you think, do you still see it not actually happening under Boris Johnson with a majority?
I've always thought it would happen under Boris Johnson.
Of course you did, but in terms of the practicality, do you think it will still happen on January the 31st?
Yes. We will leave. We will leave the European Union on the 31st of January. Where there is quite a lot of misinformation is about what happens after that. So the British government passed an act just before Christmas. We will leave on the 31st of January. We will continue in the customs union and single market up until the end of this year. I think November is the date that was put forward. And from there, dependent upon the conclusion of trade talks, we would have an arrangement by November for our future trading relationship. Remember that Brexit's in 3 parts, and it's taken us 4 years to get past part 1. The reason it's taken that long is because of the differing views in the makeup of the previous parliament. I personally think this government is going to, a shrug-shouldered approach will crash out if we have to. I don't think there'll be any further extensions or anything like that. In effect, due to European parliamentary timetables, this isn't until November to get a trade deal. In effect, we have until around about July to get a trade deal. So 6-7 months in effect. We're not going to get a good deal. And I think that from November, this is where we're going to see some problems with the economy. Look, the Brexit message was confused. I think people, by and large, don't get the technicalities of how we go about leaving. And I think, by and large, they were confused by the Labour Party's stance on Brexit. Even though, for me, it wasn't that confusing. But then again, I've lived in a political bubble for, 16 years. That's not good enough. The message wasn't clear enough. And I think really what we're going to see is an alignment still on Brexit terms. There's already a campaign about rejoining the EU, which has got something like 20,000 members, let alone more followers. And I can see that being a campaign for another referendum on that matter. I personally wouldn't suggest that referendum, if it ever did occur, it wouldn't occur until 2025 at the earliest. So I think really the issue of Brexit is going to abate somewhat because this government has a overwhelming majority to do what it wants. I can see that people will become increasingly appalled with gerrymandering of constituencies, this reduction from 650 to 600 seats. I can see that the complete erosion in workers' rights, the further sell-off of the NHS, the increase in 0 hours working, the so-called rise of the precariat. The issue of Brexit is going to be mitigated by those issues, and what I think the government will do is blame it on not being able to get out of the EU quick enough. And unfortunately, I think a lot of people will buy that message.
As opposed to so in some of the former mining areas, such as Bolsover, and then you had places like Blythe Valley, which were Labour for 50 years. It's a phone call, not sure. Okay, they were Labour for 50 years. Why weren't the domestic issues on which the Conservatives, we have the rise in food banks, the threat to the NHS, all those things. Why weren't they more prevailing than wanting to get Brexit done? Whereas actually you can see that a lot of these Leave voting northern constituencies went simply blue.
Yeah, there was someone who has been very close to me, used to be a miner, who sent me a few messages in the run-up to the election saying that they were voting Conservative. Unfortunately, after the election, I said to a lot of people, the gloves are off. There is an element of sort of class warfare with this, and the idea that former miners would be voting Tory is, frankly, I don't know what's happened there. I think that you have a situation in a lot of those constituencies whereby you've got the old left, the old Labour Party. I mean, the Labour Party was against joining the EU in the first place. At the time we had workers' protections, trade unions were a legitimate part of society, and the experience of Thatcher saw us really with our protections coming from Europe, and the position changed. There are a lot of people who hate the EU and think that we would have been much better off without it. I don't agree with that at all. I think what we've had is, you've got to bear in mind, we've had nearly 50 years of negative press about the EU, and we've also had a lot of nonsense from supporters and people who don't like the EU. In some arguments, the EU is the solution to all problems. It's not. The EU is the cause of our problems. It's not. We've blamed an international organisation instead of really holding our governments to account. I think it'd be worth noting as well that in France there is a general strike in progress. There's instructions to try and block the refineries to stop attacks on pensions by Macron's government. I wonder whether, if we weren't so consumed by blaming the EU and actually turned our sights to the government, whether or not, if we were to have adopted a French approach, whether or not we'd be talking about the WASPy women, whether we'd be talking about 0 hours contracts, or whether we'd be talking about, we seemingly in this Thatcherite Britain, I watched Star Wars last night, and the evil emperors got involvement. Spoilers, by the way. And he was mentioning and talking, I'll not spoil it any further. But I thought, well, yeah, that emperor reminds me of Thatcher and how proud she would be about this Sith Britain that we've got. You know, we've got to bear in mind a lot of people did vote Labour, don't hold Tory views. It's a miracle the number of people I've spoke to who said, oh, I voted Labour, and yet somehow in my area of the world, the entirety of Cumbria is blue. Well, bar one bit, which is yellow, is blue. So someone voted for them. I think you've got the old left who wanted us out at all costs, battling against a more younger generation who have brought up with, you know, free travel movement and what have you.
So also we have him. We mentioned France. They went onto the streets as soon as it was announced that the pension age might be increasing, and we've had that, and people don't seem to go out onto the streets. It's going up to 66, then 67, then 68, but they only proposed. And the French government only proposed a rise to 64, and that got rioting on the streets. So that's another thing we don't seem to have en masse anyway. I know there's protest movements such as Extinction Rebellion and some of the demos that we do get, but we don't seem to have the mass movements against some unpopular changes like that.
Well, we don't, but again, we've had 100 years of anti-trade union press. So the people who would traditionally lead in this country, it's a different makeup in France, but the number of people who would traditionally lead protests, I just speak with the Waspy women. A member of my family has been caught up with this, only found out a few months ago. And so, you know, it really caused quite a few problems. Traditionally, that would be the response in the country would be, well, I don't know, some sort of action by the unions in support with other groups. It's not happened. It seems that, you know, when I asked her whether or not, you know, she joined a group or done anything, and the answer was, well, no, not really. I've signed an online petition. I thought, well, there we go. Is that the answer? We've just become, you know, petition clickers, armchair activists, as opposed to getting out and doing things. Personally, I think the time's right for a general strike. Look, your rights are taken away. If you don't know what your rights are, that's another problem. They'll be taken away. You'd be unknown to it. But, you know, this idea of rights is very important to me because I believe they're either rights or the temporary privileges. If the Prime Minister with the stroke of a pen can remove your rights, they were never rights in the first place, just a temporary privilege. And they're always taken away. They're very rarely given back. So in France, they have a cultural mindset as well as an industrial mindset, which is, no, why should our pensions increase? We fought literally. They fought literally for those rights, and for it to be taken away from them is grossly unjust. And before anyone says, "Oh yes, well, gold-plated this," really have a look at the amounts we're talking about in terms of the pension, and actually. When people retire, they're quite useful for the economy because they're out spending. You're of no use when you're in a 0 hours job working. You're not out spending. So, look, we've got to get real here. You know, in this country, I do worry for its future. I think that the political landscape will change somewhat towards the right. It might be mitigated by the environment crisis.
Because we're seeing in Australia at the moment that the country's more or less literally all on fire, and even though things seem quite normal over here in Europe right now, it's a stark reminder of just how severe things can get by ignoring the global warming crisis. And this is after a year in which Extinction Rebellion were hitting the news, and now we have some big evidence that, oh yes, actually this is how bad it can get, with soaring temperatures, and we even had fire in 2018 above the Arctic Circle, didn't we?
Well, we had fires across the moors. I think it was early last year or the year before. In this country, we had Saddleworth Moor was on fire. Area around Bolton. There were parts of this country that were ablaze. The idea is, here's the other reality. People say we're killing the planet. We're not. The planet's fine. The planet will be just fine. At best, our species is a surface nuisance. But the planet, it's probably got a mild headache. But the planet will be fine. It'll shake us off and it will grow again. So the planet's fine. It's us that aren't fine. We're making our only habitat unlivable. And if you think that, Boris Johnson and his counterpart in the White House really care about that at all, you've got another thing coming.
And I suppose if we do encounter environmental crises, more floods, for example, whatever's going to happen in the 2020s that will also be quite extreme in Britain, then we'll be looking at, again, what will be the response of the Boris Johnson government, just like Scott Matthews in Australia didn't even seem to be willing to pay the firefighters, for example. He's actually relying on teams of volunteer firefighters, some of whom have died trying to tackle these.
Firefighters are volunteers in Australia, yes. which is staggering, really. I think we come back to Britain. The outgoing Brown government had ploughed quite a lot of money into grants for solar panels. There was the beginnings of a green industry beginning to grow. That was cut by Cameron, and that industry really struggled and still is. There could have been an opportunity for a green industrial revolution in this country, and really one of the first countries out there to actually have that green revolution. I don't see that that's going to happen. I don't see any progressive ideas coming when we have a government that seems hell-bent on blame as opposed to trying to sort things. Don't forget, if the economy goes west, which I think it will towards the end of this year, the Tories don't have anyone to blame.
And that's why the idea of who we might pick as Labour leader could be more crucial at that point, because we're talking about who is going to be the one that might be turned to next if they have nowhere to go in the next election. Although, of course, they might be changing things, like you say, reducing the amount of constituencies and bringing in ID for people to vote. I'll just return slightly to the WASPy women, which is actually the situation is, if you're a woman aged 60 to 65, you formally got the pension at age 60. You were given about 3 years warning, but now you would have to sign on, or up until the age of 66. So it's a big change. I wonder where those votes actually went. Because surely though a lot of those people would not have been voting for the government that did actually raise the pension age. So,
well, you would like to think,
but not necessarily as simple as that. Maybe, I don't know, but some of them I don't know.
Well, there are lots of factors with the election results. There were factors around racism, anti-Semitism in the Labour Party, which I don't recognise the term endemic, but there is a broader rise in racism, homophobia, anti-Semitism, sexism in this country that needs to be tackled. I mean, really, my involvement in politics is sort of coming to an end in a way for lots of reasons. But I do think that why couldn't the Labour Party have a joint leader? I think a balance similar to the Green Party. I think Labour needs to have a female leader from the north as well. I can't see that they wouldn't find, the WASPy women wouldn't find a friend with a female Labour leader. Well, the last Tory female leader didn't seem to care.
So what we have now is, well, it's going to be put in this. It's like a little election, isn't it? Just like with Boris Johnson, who was picked through the Conservative leadership only, and now presumably, irrespective of gender or even which part of the country, it's just going to be down to the members who they want to see in that position now. And and some of the front runners include Ian Lavery, Rebecca Long Bailey, and Keir Starmer. So you might get a woman, you might get someone from the north. So just before, I think we should tackle where do we think the Remain votes and the Leave votes actually went. I think we know where the Leave votes mostly went, obviously. But before we do, why was it? Now I'm sitting in an area that has been staunchly Labour mostly for decades. There will be some Conservative support in Neston, for example, where I'm from. But this area, going up the Wirral Peninsula, through Chester and Liverpool, and also stretching over to Manchester as well, remained staunchly behind Labour. Presumably they were even behind Jeremy Corbyn. And some of these places were slightly difficult as well, because in my constituency here, for example, it was a Leave voting constituency, and yet it still gave quite a thumping majority to the Labour MP here. He did lose a couple of thousand off it. So why do you think this area managed to hold out so well?
I think it's a great question. It's something I've been warning for quite a while now. We used to, I used to talk about change elections being every 30, 40 years. And I think I said to you last time we spoke that this isn't necessarily one of those. The first election of the 2020s would be. With that, though, what I mean by change election, for those who didn't listen, is every 40 years or so there's a fundamental change in the direction of the country. The last one, you could argue, was Blair. Actually, I think Thatcher, and it's and a continuation with Blair. Prior to that, you'd be looking at Wilson. Prior to that, you'd be looking at Attlee. Now, one of the things that's happening in the UK, and more broadly across the West, is the last national election that we really had in this country was 2010. What's been happening over the past 10 years has been not a national picture, but increasingly regional. We're seeing this with, of course, the rise of the SNP, but you have not necessarily geographic regions. So I'm not talking about the Northwest. I'm talking about maybe groups of constituencies that are voting on their own issues and have their own identity. When you look at some of the problems with the polls, so a lot of the polling companies have begun to recognise this and was conducting constituency-based polling. I think when we look at Liverpool, Manchester, there is a degree of commonality, and there is a tacit remembrance of what the Tories did in those places, as well as actually we've got Labour representatives who we can talk to. We've not got some fox hunting, six-toed, you-know-what. You've got going out with a national picture then, so saying that we're one nation, or however you want to phrase it, is a nonsense. There needs to be in politics an understanding that people looking at sort of sub-regional issues, the issues, for example, in Liverpool. I was talking to a few days before the election, the now MP for Birkenhead, Mick Whitley, about this, which was, well, the issues in Birkenhead are actually wildly different to that in, say, Copeland. So I think, the path for the party to win, the Labour Party, I should say, to win the next election, or in fact any party, I'd guess, but for the Labour Party, is to develop a manifesto that is regional, that understands that there are different issues. For example, you talk about a national, one of the things in the manifesto was around infrastructure. Well, actually, what does that mean in, let's say, the west coast of Cumbria, where if you're trying to get to work, you want a single carriageway that's often blocked by farm traffic? That discussion barely occurred, and yet it is a significant issue. We talk about the NHS for while it survives, barely. That is a national issue, but there are also regional elements within it. For example, where there is a more elderly community, care is a huge issue. I'm not suggesting it's not in others, but it certainly takes a little bit more of a prime focus with some voters, as compared to a younger generation who some of the issues are around schooling. So that's the reason why you see that there are still lumps, groups, better than lumps, of constituencies, like you say in Liverpool, Manchester. It doesn't matter whether it's Remain or Leave. Actually, the issues sort of transcended that singular issue. In Westmoreland, for example, where you've got people who genuinely feel that they've been ignored for so long by Westminster, plenty of voters I've spoke to who said, well, we voted to leave to spite the government. We've been ignored for so long. So their voting patterns are a little bit more different and complex and nuanced than first might meet the eye.
Yeah, I lost the cordless headphones. I had to quickly replace it. Right, trying to do something for the environment there as well, using rechargeable batteries, but they only lasted about half an hour. So there you go. Right, so that's so you think really regional concerns, but also when we did a short interview with the Ellesmere Port Mayor, wife of Justin Madders MP. She said we can see much more clearly in the northwest the damaging effects of Tory policy, such as in Liverpool, for example. We've got all sorts of homeless people, on every street corner. I was there on New Year's Eve, actually, and there was a tent down one street. So I suppose in some of the Leave voting constituencies, you might not see as much visible homelessness, for example. But it could be a factor that we actually see the result of social policies.
I think again, it depends on how nuanced it. I mean, I also just have to say something, which is, well, of course Liverpool aren't going to vote Tory. The Sun's banned there, so I wonder how people would vote if the Sun or the Daily Mail was banned across the country. I think, certainly they might end up thinking a little harder. But I think the issue with it just being a Leave Remain argument, I think in some areas that had a huge impact. In other areas, I think the issue of the referendum had been was a little lower down on the agenda.
Now the question now is it might. I was wondering if this was an absolutely unwinnable election for Labour, no matter what stands have been taken over Leave or Remain, because obviously to back Leave fully, that would have alienated many of the Remainer support that Labour has. Also to do the other way and say it's only going to be the soft Brexit. We're going to honour the results of the referendum because that will be undemocratic not to. And some people were concerned that they were being undemocratic because of that. Even in offering a second referendum, they would have also been abandoned by the Remainer support, but also it might still have lost out to Boris Johnson's government there for some, because they said it would only be a soft deal, for example. So if they picked either side, what Jeremy Corbyn did do is decide to say, you know what, we're going to have a second referendum. But it seems like all options were in fact poison chalices, if you like. Do you think? Question is, where do you think the Remain voters did go in this election, and what do you think? Do you think they were just damned in all possible choices, the three choices they could have made?
Yes, and no. So I think Remain voters, in some areas, certainly went to the Greens. The Liberal Democrats didn't have quite as good a night as they were promised. But I think that a lot of people, did two things: stayed at home, voted Labour, pinching their nose if they were a traditional Liberal. I don't think there was, and we don't really have a tradition of tactical voting in Britain, or if we did, it favoured the Tories. As for it being an unwinnable election, I think you're right to an extent. I think what I'd have been interested in seeing is if Labour said we would adopt a Norway model, a so-called Norway model, or we'll stay within the customs union or something like that, and picked one that said, we'll leave the EU, but through a bone out which said, whilst we'd go for a Norway model, we would put this back to a referendum about rejoining the EU or accepting that model. I think that might have scuppered Dominic Cummings and Johnson's hell-bent on crashing Britain out. That, I think, might have improved matters somewhat, but whether that would have been enough, I really don't know. You've got to bear in mind the Brexit party were causing problems. In many ways, there is an elephant in the room with the unwinnable election. The Tories were using data from anyone who was going onto the any.gov website. I don't think that this was a clean election. I think if we'd have had our election and it was somehow in Venezuela, somewhere like that, we'd be calling it somewhat corrupt.
There were some quite dirty tactics used, such as changing the Twitter name. The Conservatives were changing the Twitter name during the Johnson Corbyn debate on TV to Fact Check UK. Just shows a level of ruthlessness as well.
Well, I've got examples, and I'm not on about to a friend or anything. I have actually seen this being presented, not only because one arrived at this house, addressed to me of all people, but the same thing had happened to a few others that I know, where postal votes were coming with a paperclip attachment of a letter from Boris Johnson saying why I should vote for him.
On the postal voting form. That's a little bit biased then, isn't it?
Well, yes.
Imagine Jeremy Corbyn was able to do that. Or just attach a promotional thing. I mean, the right-wing press and media would have had an absolute field day at that, and yet Boris Johnson seemed to get away with almost anything, including looking a bit dishevelled at the cenotaph himself.
Well, this is it. You couple this with some of the issues from Laura Koonsberg with the BBC and from the state broadcaster that's meant to be impartial, absolutely was not in this election. And, well, it's one swear word, which the arse-licking approach of the BBC has obviously not worked, because in the targets now is in the sites for the Tories is the BBC.
Decriminalising the licence fee, he said, yes, so obviously for their own survival.
They will turn it into Netflix, basically.
Yes. And then Channel 4 as well, because they empty-chaired Boris Johnson when he wouldn't take part in the climate change debate. Obviously, things like Australia aren't that important, so things are happening, But I mean, there were already some fires at that point, weren't there? Even before Christmas, it's got even bad.
Well, at least Channel 4 and Channel 4 News are doing what the BBC should do, which is ask everyone uncomfortable questions, as opposed to watch an episode of Question Time.
Boris Johnson was threatened Channel 4 following that by saying that he would look at their public service obligations, presumably whether that's going to be remembered, or the comment that he made pre-election about the possible decriminalising of the licence fee for the BBC, which would mean that you could choose whether to pay us or not, basically, couldn't you?
Oh yeah, that's coming. Let's make no about it. The BBC will be finished within the next 5 years. It wouldn't surprise me if Johnson actually extends the mandate from 5 to 6 years, but the franchise, from 5 to 6 years. I'm not suggesting that that's been said or rumoured anywhere. I'm just saying I wouldn't be surprised. BBC, I mean, education, there has been a absolute, and it should be a scandal, in the way that FE colleges are funded with devolution. Not only, if you take Manchester, for example, where trade unions rely upon funding from devolved areas to continue their ability to teach reps. Well, what's happened with Manchester, the Mayor of Manchester, Andy Burnham, for some reason isn't supporting trade union centres, apart from within the devolved area. Now, some might say, well, that's fine. He's looking after Greater Manchester, but, areas outside of Greater Manchester that might have reps within it, for example. It's not just the trade union funding. There's all of the other courses, from street lighting, etc., with FE colleges, that because of devolved fundings have meant if you're not in a devolved area, you really are going to be struggling for funding. I just see that as, well, the next step is those colleges will close, and what will be replaced is private contractors. It's privatisation already going on, something that hasn't been discussed enough in this country. It should be a scandal. It's not.
It's a glossary as well about what you'll get because it's funded better in Wales and Scotland. So with devolution powers as well. You've got the chance to go to university for free in Scotland, and you haven't got that in England, and Wales has softer conditions.
Based on the postcode, really, isn't it?
Yes, because you could be in Neston or Ness Inverness, couldn't you? So it just depends where you happen to be, what services you can get.
If you live on the border with Scotland, as I do, essentially you can't go into Scotland because you're English. Oh, and that sets quite a dark precedent. I think anyone would agree with that.
So that relates to that if you're an English student, you can't apply to a Scottish university and get the fees waived. It has to be the tuition fees. That's what you're talking about. It's the same.
Yes.
You could be in Glasgow, or you could be in Leeds. Same tuition fee, same debt.
Yeah. You live in the same country. And yet the standard of education might be different, or the means testing. If you're in Northern Ireland, you can't get funding. Let's say if you work in in England, then you can't claim funding. It's an utterly ludicrous system where, we're talking about regional issues. Well, one of the things that's driving it are things like the postcode lotteries with education, with health even. This is we talk about bringing the country together. Well, that's nothing to do with Brexit, and there's already parts there that are dividing us.
So another thing I think we could do as the last topic on this, I think, for an approximately an hour run, would be that is that the referendum had happened by 2017. It had happened in 2016, and there was some momentum, obviously a pun there, behind Corbyn's campaign then in that election, and the issues that he was able to campaign on did resonate, such as the wanting the massive increase in public funding and to sort out problems with the homelessness, NHS, and poverty in this country, 0-hour contracts. Why would that be any different 2 years later when we have another shot at a general election in 2019? We still have it was starting to look like a Brexit deadlock even in 2017, and yet Brexit seemingly became the main issue in 19, but it didn't seem to matter so much in 17, so much that Theresa May even lost the majority, the slim majority she had, and she was hoping to do the same as Boris Johnson, but it didn't happen.
Well, again, it comes to the fact that over the past 2 years, what has changed? There's been more attacks on Labour Party, people being ridiculed for voting Labour. There's been an effective silence on previously trusted institutions. You couldn't pick up a headline without Corbyn. So they demonised the person who was trying to help people, and there's no getting away from the fact that does have an effect.
So that's what we saw, and as you said before, you find it dark that there's the power of the press, but actually the elections have all been won where the sun has backed them, so he said Cameron Hope in 2010, for example, backs Blair, we got the biggest landslide, and again trying to slur Jeremy Corbyn by making out that Marxism, for example, putting a dark word on Marxism.
Well, I wish they'd have talked about Marxism a little bit more.
To see what it actually is.
I think John McDonnell had a great idea to debate the Chancellor about the merits of what Marxism is and what it isn't.
Yes.
But again, there's a complete lack of political education in Britain. I'm not just referring to politics. I'm talking about the in terms of political parties. I'm on about the politics of how to afford things in a house, the prices of milk, sausages on plates, that kind of stuff. There's a real lack of political education on that. So when people hear Marxism, they think the Soviet Union, as opposed to, well, okay, let's have a look at some of the more socialist ideas that Marxism spent. I mean, I could speak about Marxism for a long time. I think another comment, especially poignant at the moment, is the sort of neocon agenda for global affairs. We're potentially on the eve of quite a rapidly escalating conflict with Iran. I would hope that the EU support the Iranian regime, who has supported the nuclear deal from Obama's time, which the US have walked away from. I think calm heads is what would be needed, and we don't have them in this country or across the pond. This is the sort of other area where it's funny, we tend to, as a species at least, we seem to get rid of the people who preach peace. From Jesus Christ, you could go to Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, Gandhi, John Lennon. I could carry on. We seem to demonize people who say, well, hey, let's not go to war. It dominated, in fact, part of the election debate. Would you press the red button? It's frightening.
Because it was painted as being irresponsible almost not to press it by the right-wing press because it became an issue of national security. Well, if they do, if some other country does it to us, we'd better annihilate them as well, sort of thing. And so that was the level of that debate.
But for those Labour Party members who spent their waking moments and activists and supporters knocking on doors, talking to people, I would just say, don't get bitter, get better. And, you know, there can only be thanks for the work that you did. There was a small army of people who, in winter time, it's not easy when it's bitterly cold, raining, trying to support the party you believe in.
Yes, I mean, was that another factor as well? Just because it was easier to have, you know, Corbyn turn up at Glastonbury and have all the celebrities coming out with the bus in the summer. Just literally the timing of the election might have been a contributing factor to.
I think a small one. I don't know anyone who's been, you know, Dawn French said that she wanted to support someone. I don't think anyone really changes the vote. I don't think people are even that vapid that they would just vote on based on a celebrity. It could be, you know, winter time's not exactly the feel-good time until you get to Christmas and festivities, but even then, not for everyone. I don't think that the time of the election helped, but it didn't really hinder turnout as much as, well, even I thought.
Yeah. Okay. Well, those are some of the thoughts that you've got over it, over what happened.
Did we have any questions?
I'm afraid I did not give the address out as well, so we should have done that. Sounds like I'd be good in government, actually, with the amount of things that I yes, Minister, you know, the things that I don't to put through. You know, I'm afraid there weren't any questions this time, but I'll tell you what, I'll read it out now. If you want to send an email to aj@channel107.co.uk, Facebook, Michael Farrie, also Channel 107 on Twitter, if there's anything that comes in by the time of the repeat tomorrow. But we were very suddenly on air today. Yes, so that means that the only questions have come from me.
Yeah, okay, well, that's absolutely fine. Well, again, thank you for having me very hastily put together. But again, just to anyone who's listening, you know, now is the time that we, as a country, well, actually, as a people, we really do need to look after people. Just because Christmas is done with, it doesn't mean that there aren't a lot of people on the streets who increasingly are looking for help, and the government aren't going to offer any answers. So to that army of people who were out door knocking, it would be a revolutionary idea for those same people to, instead of going out giving out leaflets, went out and volunteered at the food banks with homeless charities, with people who are lonely at Christmas, you know, the elderly. So we have a mental health crisis in the UK.
Yes, I mean, I've
personally.
I saw that in some cases they would open the shelter only for Christmas Day and Christmas Eve and such like, but it's actually just, it doesn't matter if it's Christmas, does it? It's all the time.
It is, and it's horrendous to say that. Last year, there were 30 people who were either close to me or I knew who ended their own lives for very complicated reasons, each individual. But those people, if even half of the people who are out campaigning for the election offered any kind of support, it doesn't have to be, you know, 5 days of the week, even an hour a week, something like that, then, you know, please do. I can make available through the radio station some suggested charities, support groups, certainly from around the Northwest and some nationally, but just try and help the government's not going to be coming to the rescue anytime soon.
No. And that's where we leave it with that thought. Thank you, Jay Martin, for your thoughts on what happened with Labour during the general election of 2019 and the aftermath.